Today we are going to add validation to a simple form with 4 inputs. Our structure is straightforward, where each input sharing the same interface. Each input includes the following details: type, ID, name, placeholder, value, onChange. All fields are required. The name attribute will be responsible for the name of field in our state, which I will demonstrate later. The current issue is that we have created separate states for every input, and as a result we have 4 handlers like setEmail, setText, and so on. Let's begin by writing a custom hook use form. It will be another approach that's generally more adaptable and easy to maintain, especially when dealing with numerous input fields in our form. This approach involves using a single state instead of many. This hook will receive initial state, which will be used to store the initial values of our inputs. We will start by defining the state using useState with formData and setFormData function, where initial state is our default state. Our hook will return formData with all inputs values and function handleChange, which we will define next. The handleChange function takes event as its argument and updates the data in our state. Every event provides a name and a value. Utilizing the name field, we create a single, general event handler that is more efficient than having 4 separate handlers for each field. The next step is to implement setFormData. In this function, we will return the previous data along with the updated value using the field's name. So let's write prevData and our name with value. Our function is red right now, so something went wrong. There is a small error here. Let's replace event with value. Now let's substitute the state in our components with our custom hook. This hook returns formData and handleChange. Additionally, we need to provide initial state for our fields, where all values are initially set to empty strings. So let's add empty string for email, JS, password, and repeat password. So let's finish it. And now we can delete formData from handleSubmit function because we created formData in our useForm hook. The final step is to replace the value and onChange attributes for all our inputs. Instead of using local states, we'll use the values from formData. Go ahead and make this replacement for all inputs. As a result, our inputs have become controlled components. Let's delete extra useState and check if our fields are editable. Alright, now we are all set to implement validation in our form. I will be integrating the validation process into the useForm hook to keep everything centralized. Let's begin by adding a function validateForm to the useForm hook, which will handle all the validation logic. First, we will create an errors object to store the validation errors for the inputs. So let's create errors with empty object, where empty object will be initial value. Starting with the email input, I will use a simple function isValidEmail, which I have already created. This function uses a basic email validation regex. We have more helper functions available, but for now, I will stick to isValidEmail. Let's ensure we use the correct function path and then proceed with the validation form function. The initial if statement will focus on email validation. We will pass the email value from formData to isValidEmail for validation. If isValidEmail returns false, we will add a new field to the errors object, labeling it as email, and provide an error message. Email is not valid, for example. Next up is password validation. While we implement various rules for validation, for this video I will keep it simple. A password will be considered valid if it's at least 4 symbols long. If the password is too short, we will add a password field to the errors object and set the error message to password should be at least 4 symbols long. We will apply the same validation rule to the name field. Updating the error message to name should be at least 4 symbols long. So let's finish it. Let's add length less than 4 and copy password message. Text field doesn't have any sense, to be honest. Let's replace it with the name instead of text label. This change will provide a more logical on text. So let's change all values in our statement and in our component. Probably here as well. Now that we have made this adjustment, we can move forward. Now we can finish our validation form with the last if statement, but we can check if password and repeat password are the same. If they are not the same, we will show the error message. The error message is passwords don't match. Let's finish it. And now we have all messages. Our next task is to write a state to hold the validation errors. We'll use validation errors and set validation errors function for this purpose. The initial value will be the same as we had for the inputs, empty strings. An empty string in the error field means that there are no any errors. So let's add React.useState with initial state, where initial state will be our object with empty strings. Since we are using the same object multiple times, it's a good idea to create a separate initial state object. This object will have 4 fields, all initialized with empty strings. Now let's remove it from our component to have our initial state in one place. And moving back to the validation logic, we need to use set validation errors to save our errors to state and then pass our error object to it. Furthermore, our validation form function will return true if there are any errors and false if there are none. This will help us easily determine if the form is valid or not. To provide accessibility outside this hook, we will add validation errors to the returned object from the hook. Similarly, we will do the same for validation form. Lastly, in this part, let's import validate form and validation errors from the use form hook. We will display validation errors after submitting the form. To do this, we'll use an if statement to check if our form is valid. Now, let's open the console, intentionally trigger some invalid fields, and observe if we are already receiving the corresponding errors. Let's add email and the rest of fields. As you can see, the errors are being displayed as expected. We have successfully implemented validation errors, but our UI isn't yet aware of them. To address this, let's display validation messages below each input field. To start, we'll write a span element with the last name for displaying the error message. However, we should only show this message when there is an error. We can achieve this by using the validation errors object. Additionally, we will add the actual error message content to our span element. We will follow the same steps for the remaining fields. Once we have added error messages to the UI, they should appear below the inputs with errors. Test this by entering invalid values, and as you can see, the error messages appear as expected. Also, validation after submitting the form is a good approach, but better to provide real-time validation feedback. This means showing or hiding errors immediately as a user types. To achieve this, let's add a new state, isSubmitted, along with the corresponding setIsSubmitted function in our custom hook. The default value will be false, that means that form is not submitted yet. We will add them to the returned object to enable access from outside the hook. Now, let's copy and paste our validation function into the handle submit function. So let's do it. Oops, something went wrong. Let's do it one more time. So here we run setIsSubmitted. The next step involves adding a condition to our use form hook. We'll use the useFact hook to check if submitted is true. When it's true, we'll run the validate form function. So let's add if statement is submitted. Let's run validate form. Don't forget to include is submitted and validate form in the dependency array. While implementing this, you might notice a warning that validate form doesn't use all by. Although this warning doesn't pose a problem, let's address it by wrapping our function with React use all by. Make sure to add form data as a dependency. Let's verify if everything works by introducing some invalid fields. The error messages should appear, and they should be hidden as soon as the issues are corrected. Email right now is valid, but we still see email is not valid message. So something went wrong. Let's try to find mistake. And probably we forgot to add true to our set is submitted function. Let's fix it and try to test it one more time. Let's add some invalid fields. And as you can see, email works. So the error is hidden right now because email is valid. So now everything works. Our component is quite large and a little hard to manage. It's all in one place, which can be a bit messy. So what we want to do is move a who into its own separate file. First, let's add useform file. Then, copy the who that we are talking about and open a new file and pass that who into the file. Now, because we are using useState, we need to import React. This is how we do it. To have opportunity to use our who outside, let's add as per default. The next step is to remove a part of the code from our main component. Instead of having that code directly in the component, we are going to import it. Let's import useForm from who/useForm. We no longer need to worry about setting up the initial state here, so let's delete it from the component and move it to our useForm who. The isValidEmail function has also been moved to this who. Our main component doesn't handle this validation anymore. So let's add import isValidEmail from helpers and isValidEmails, or just email. So let's check if our form works as previously. Let's add some invalid fields, and we have some email is not valid message, and also it disappears. So everything works as expected. Now let's talk about another thing. We have 4 very similar components, and this isn't very efficient. So what we will do is create just one component and use it in different parts of our app file. Here is what you need to do. First, let's create a new file, input. The next one, copy the input from where it's now and pass it into the input file. Inside the input file, we'll create a special function that represents our component. Let's add function input and let's pass all our input from the main component. Return and our HTML. This component we are talking about has certain things it needs: a label, a type, a value, and error message, and also function to handle changes. So let's add all values, error, and handle change. Now we need to replace our old values to a new one. So let's start from validation errors. We just change it to error. The next one is value. We will change the value as well. The next one is placeholder. I think that placeholder is the same as label. Yes, so probably we can reuse instead of placeholder just our label. So let's change it just to label as a placeholder. Now about the label. React has useID who, but we won't use it because the values it gives us can be unpredictable. So instead of useID, we will use transform to MLAs. So let's add this function, transform to MLAs, which receives our label. So let's add our label here and let's just add some example. So we have repeat password label, but transfer to MLS will return repeat password in MLS and without any spaces. Remember, we need to import React and our transform to MLS function from helpers folder. Here we have React and the next line will be for transform to MLS. Let's add our path helpers transform to MLS. So why do we need this transform to MLS function? When we save any values of our inputs to our store, we need to have the name of this field, because we have only value, but also we need to understand the name of the field. Although React has user who, we won't use it because the values it gives us can be unpredictable. So instead of, for example, repeat password, we will receive some just random number plus letters that will not help us with our store. So let's change our name from email to ID. Let's do it. The next one, ID, will be equal ID, but from transform to MLS function. Type we will take from our props, and the next one is label plus our HTML4. HTML4 will be equal to ID. That's all for this component. After we have made these changes in the input component, import the input into our app component and use it here. This makes our app simple and more organized. After refactoring, our component is more readable and testable. To make sure everything works correctly, let's test it by entering values into the input. So don't worry, we haven't broken anything. Everything works as expected. We have one more optimization which is better to add. Let me show you the problem. First, let's open React DevTools and enable showing of rendering. So when something updates, we can visually see it. When we change only one field, the rest of fields will be re-rendered as well. So let's try to fix it. First of all, let's open our input component. I'm going to use React Memo. React Memo helps React to skip rendering a component if its props have not changed. So as a result, it will improve our performance. So let's add here React.memo. Let's do it. And we also need to add a raw function here. So let's do it. It's not very readable, so let's increase our window for our component. Let's open also use form just to check if we need to change something there. Handle change validation form. So maybe it will be a good idea just to check what we have now in our page. Let's check it. Refreshing the page, and as you can see, we don't have name of the component anymore. So let's fix it by adding display name, where display name will be our input. And now everything is fixed. So let's check it one more time, and probably we need to add some optimization to our use form hook. I think handle change is good and did that. Let's add React use allback to this function with empty dependencies. So let's finish it and open our app one more time. Let's open it in the separate window. Let's refresh the page and let's add some values. So as you can see, it highlights only that input which we update. That means that React doesn't render the rest of components which we don't update right now. I hope this explanation helps you to improve your React skills. Don't forget to like the video. Bye.